It was a Saturday afternoon in the small town of Marin, Iowa. Nothing extraordinary, yet everything about it was wrapped in the warmth of familiarity. Melody Hoffman, a 20-year-old woman with a radiant smile, was the kind of person who made others feel like they'd known her their whole life. For those close to her, she was the epitome of kindness, trusting, caring, and utterly unafraid to embrace the world with open arms. From a young age, Melody's connection to her family was undeniable. Her mother, Megan, had always been her rock, guiding her through life's challenges with love and patience. They shared more than just mother and daughter moments, they were best friends. And then there were the animals. Melody's deep love for them led her to volunteer at the local animal shelter, where she found solace among those who couldn't speak for themselves. She had dreams, big ones, of working in healthcare, perhaps in a nursing home, helping others the way she had been taught to help animals. Melody's heart was pure, and she had all the ambition in the world. But there was something that set her apart. Diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability, Melody's world moved at a slower pace. It wasn't that she couldn't dream, she did, often and vividly. But her ability to process and make decisions was years behind her physical age. She had the body of a 20-year-old but the mind of someone much younger. Her trusting nature made her an easy target. Melody didn't question people, especially those she loved. She welcomed them with open arms, even when those arms might have been better shielded. Her decision-making, clouded by an innocent heart, led her into a relationship that, over time, would unravel in ways no one could have predicted. Her ex-boyfriend, McKinley Lisma, Melody's first real love, had been a huge part of her life. But when he suddenly ended their relationship just after the holidays, everything shifted. McKinley's return to his ex-girlfriend, Nikia, caused deep heartbreak for Melody, and the once carefree girl became increasingly withdrawn. Megan, noticing the sudden change in her daughter's behavior, began to worry. Melody, once so open, became secretive, withdrawing into herself. And as her mother's concern grew, so did the tension surrounding Melody's life. A tension that no one could see coming, and one that would soon lead to tragedy. It was a quiet Saturday evening, just like any other. Melody and her mother, Megan, had spent the day together, shopping, grabbing tacos for lunch, and enjoying a cozy dinner at home. The evening settled into a peaceful rhythm. After their meal, the two curled up in bed, watching a movie, just the two of them like they had so many times before. Melody, with her carefree spirit, was always there, her infectious laughter filling the air. But tonight, something was different. Around 11:30 p.m., after the movie had ended, something strange happened. Melody, without a word, stood up and slipped out of the room. Her actions, so sudden and without explanation, didn't quite register with Megan at first. She figured Melody was just stepping out for a moment, maybe to grab something from the kitchen. But when the minutes ticked by and Melody didn't return, concern began to creep into Megan's mind. Megan pulled out her phone. No texts. No call. Just silence. Then a ping. Melody's location had just updated on the tracking app. She was leaving the house. The familiar red dot moved steadily northward, toward an area Megan knew well, but why would Melody be out at this hour? Are you kidding me? Come back home right now, Megan typed, her worry now turning into frustration. She hit send. Seconds passed. No reply. Then another ping. Melody's phone was moving, but not in a straight line. The dot danced around Morgan Creek Park, before it circled back toward the direction of home. Megan's heart rate quickened as she watched her daughter's location becoming more erratic, more unsettling. Something wasn't right. The ping continued to jump, sending Megan's anxiety spiraling. She sent another message demanding that Melody come home. Where are you? Why aren't you responding? The language in Melody's replies seemed odd, too calm, too detached, almost as if they weren't even her words at all. The way she texted felt foreign, and in that moment, Megan realized something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. These weren't the messages from her daughter. They were from someone else. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. This wasn't Melody. Her daughter never texted like this, not with full sentences, not so deliberate and strange. Something was terribly wrong. Megan, in a panic, called Melody's phone over and over. No answer. The worry now coiled tight in her chest. The location was still pinging, still moving. Was she being followed? Was something happening to her daughter? The clock ticked. The night seemed endless. Melody's last location, Morgan Creek Park. But as the minutes dragged on, the ping disappeared. No more updates. No more texts. No more responses. At 3:13 a.m., the phone rang with an emergency notification. A crash. Melody's iPhone had detected an impact. Megan's heart dropped. She grabbed her keys and rushed out into the night, praying for a miracle, hoping that the crash wasn't anything more than an accident. But that night, the truth of what had happened to Melody was only just beginning to unfold. The night was growing colder, and with each passing minute, the silence between mother and daughter deepened. Melody's phone continued to ping, tracking her through familiar streets, though the erratic nature of her movements was anything but familiar. Megan watched helplessly as the small red dot on her screen danced around Morgan Creek Park. Then it shifted. The tracking app updated, showing Melody's phone near an apartment complex, just blocks away from home. Megan's texts were now frantic. "Where are you, Melody?" she typed, hitting send, then immediately tapping again, "Please answer me." But the silence grew heavier with each message, each unanswered call. The text replies were becoming increasingly odd, distant. Gone were the quick, casual responses that had once been Melody's signature. The words in her texts were different, almost deliberate, like a stranger was typing, not the daughter Megan knew so well. Each new message felt like a knot being tied around Megan's chest. "I'll be home soon." It was a simple reply, but it didn't make sense. Melody always let her know when she was going to be late. Always. And then, as if on cue, Melody's phone seemed to stop responding altogether. Megan's heart raced. Her fingers trembled as she tapped on the screen once more, trying to force a response. But there was nothing. The red dot, Melody's phone, moved again further away from home. It was heading south now, toward an unfamiliar part of town. No answers. No calls returned. Just that incessant tracking taunting her. Each new location felt like another step deeper into a mystery. Why was Melody going further away? What was she doing out there at this hour? Had something happened? Or worse, was someone else involved? And then, just as the clock struck 3:13 a.m., the screen lit up with a new notification. The familiar chime of Apple's emergency impact service. The message was simple yet chilling: crash detected. Location, Highway 100. A crash. In the middle of the night. Without warning. Without explanation. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. Her worst fears, those that had been silently gnawing at her all night, suddenly felt far too real. She grabbed her keys without hesitation, her body moving on pure instinct. The sound of the car's engine roaring to life filled the silence, and she was gone, heading towards the last known location on her daughter's phone. But even as she sped toward that stretch of highway, Megan's mind couldn't stop turning. Why had Melody been out here in the dead of night? Why hadn't she told her mother where she was going? Why hadn't she answered? There was a terrible weight to the silence now, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Each second felt like an eternity. With every mile, her thoughts spiraled further into fear. What had happened to her daughter? Why wasn't she responding? And as Megan approached the exit toward Highway 100, the dread settled over her like a heavy blanket. The night, once so calm, now felt impossibly long, filled with unanswered questions, the uncertainty hanging in the air. The truth of what had happened to Melody was still hidden, lost in the dark, silent night. But Megan was about to find out just how far this twisted turn of events had gone. The night had grown cold, and as the minutes stretched into hours, the search for Melody intensified. Megan's heart pounded with every mile she drove toward the highway, each turn of the wheel leading her closer to the unknown. But it was at Lily Lake, far from where Megan imagined she would be, that the search would take a heartbreaking turn. It was a crisp morning when a couple, enjoying a quiet walk by the lake, stumbled upon something that would forever change their lives. As they rounded a bend near the pavilion, the sight before them was anything but ordinary. A body, face down in the grass, partially obscured by the mist. At first glance, it seemed almost unreal, as if it were part of the natural landscape, a grotesque addition to the peaceful scene. But there was nothing peaceful about this. Melody Hoffman, once a vibrant young woman full of life, now lay motionless, her back covered in lacerations. The position of her body, discarded, abandoned, was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. The couple hesitated, unsure whether they were seeing something real or a nightmare unfolding before their eyes. But then the horror hit them. This was no accident. This was a murder. And it wasn't just any murder. It was the end of a life cut short, the kind of discovery that leaves you breathless with disbelief. Within minutes, the authorities were on the scene. The area was cordoned off and investigators began their work. But the moment the medical examiner examined Melody's body, the full extent of the brutality was revealed. Strangulation marks on her neck. Stab wounds, deep and violent, scattered across her torso. And as the body was turned over, investigators found clear evidence that Melody had been bound, her wrists and ankles showing marks of restraint. The sight of it all, the violence, the brutality, was sickening. But it wasn't just the physical injuries that disturbed the authorities. There was something else. Something that didn't quite fit. As the investigators examined the scene, the disturbing truth began to emerge. Melody's body hadn't been left here by chance. It had been placed, arranged with unsettling care. The crime scene wasn't where Melody had been murdered, it was where her body had been dumped. A chilling realization washed over the investigators. The murder had been carefully staged. The crime scene, with all its lurid details, was meant to look like a sexually motivated attack. Her clothing removed, her body positioned in a way that suggested foul play. But as the scene was analyzed more thoroughly, it became clear that the placement of the body had been intentional. The location where she was found, Lily Lake, was not where she had died. The body had been moved. The lake was merely the final stop on a twisted journey, a calculated move to mislead anyone who might come searching. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth of what had really happened. The question hung heavy in the air: who could have done this? Who had the knowledge to stage such a carefully planned crime, to make it look like something it wasn't? The answer, it seemed, was just out of reach, lurking in the shadows of a twisted mystery. The murder of Melody Hoffman was no simple crime. It was the beginning of a complex web of deception, one that would pull in everyone close to her and shatter the lives of those who thought they knew her best. The shock of Melody's death rippled through the small community of Marin. It was a town where everyone knew each other, and now, a young woman with so much promise had been brutally taken from them. But as the reality of the tragedy sank in, a single, undeniable truth emerged. Someone knew what had happened. Someone close to her had the answers. Investigators immediately turned their focus to Melody's phone. It was the last link to her final moments, the only piece of technology that could unlock the mystery of where she had been and why she'd gone so far from home in the dead of night. The data was telling, a trail of location updates that painted a chilling picture. Melody had been tracked to Morgan Creek Park, then the nearby apartment complex, and finally, toward the area where her body was found at Lily Lake. But one location stood out among the rest. Just before Melody's final ping, there was a pause. Her phone had stopped moving in the middle of the night, a gap that didn't add up. It was as if she had been at a standstill for some time. The investigation turned to McKinley Lisma, Melody's ex-boyfriend. He had been the last person seen with her, and the clues were beginning to point in his direction. The phone records confirmed it. McKinley had been in the area around the time Melody's phone stopped moving. Traffic cameras had caught his blue Honda Accord near the park, and later, near the apartment complex where Melody had been. Finally, it had been traced all the way to Lily Lake, the very location where her body was discovered. McKinley was an obvious person of interest. He was the first to be questioned by police. The young man, seemingly calm, gave his version of the events. According to him, he hadn't seen Melody since their breakup weeks earlier. He claimed he hadn't been near Morgan Creek Park. He had an alibi, he had been home, alone. But as the investigation continued, McKinley's story began to unravel. The timeline didn't match up. Surveillance footage had captured him in his car near the park that night. It wasn't just his whereabouts that seemed off, it was his behavior. When asked about his whereabouts, McKinley's answers were inconsistent. One minute, he claimed to have been at home all night, the next, he admitted to running errands but couldn't remember exactly where or when. When detectives pressed him about his interactions with Melody, his responses grew colder, more detached. It was as if he was trying too hard to distance himself from the situation. Why hadn't he been honest about where he had been? Why had he lied about his whereabouts? As detectives pored over McKinley's movements, it became clearer. His story was full of holes. The small lies didn't add up, and that alone was enough to raise suspicion. But it wasn't just his inconsistencies that disturbed the investigators. It was his lack of emotion, his coldness in the face of such a horrific crime. The more they dug, the more they found. McKinley had been in touch with Melody in the days leading up to her death. Text messages between the two had been uncovered, some of them heated, others filled with emotion. Melody had been devastated by their breakup, and McKinley's new relationship with Nikia, his ex-girlfriend, had only added fuel to the fire. But it wasn't just the breakup that raised questions, it was what happened after. McKinley had denied any involvement, yet his car had been seen near the park, near Melody's final known location. And when detectives checked his phone, they found something chilling. McKinley had searched for Lily Lake, the very spot where Melody's body had been found, only hours before the murder. McKinley's search history was damning. Why had he searched for the location if he had no intention of going there? Had he been planning to meet Melody there? Had he lured her there under false pretenses? With each new piece of evidence, the picture grew clearer. McKinley's lies, his erratic behavior, his disturbing lack of emotion, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. McKinley knew more than he was letting on. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was becoming clear. McKinley Lisma had a role in Melody Hoffman's tragic death. The question now was, how deep did his involvement go? And who else was connected to the crime? The search for the truth had only just begun. And the deeper the investigation went, the more sinister the answers became. McKinley had been the last to see Melody alive, but as the detectives began to dig further, they discovered that he wasn't the only one with secrets to hide. As the investigation deepened, new layers of the story began to surface. Each revelation seemed more chilling than the last, unraveling a dark web of betrayal, jealousy, and twisted emotions. The pieces of Melody's life, and the life of the man she once loved, were slowly being laid bare. And what they uncovered was nothing short of devastating. The love triangle that emerged was as complicated as it was heartbreaking. McKinley Lisma had recently rekindled a relationship with his ex-girlfriend, Nikia. Their connection was now more than just a past love, it was a future together. Nikia was pregnant with McKinley's child. The news had brought an unexpected sense of joy to McKinley, who had moved back in with Nikia and her family. For a moment, it seemed as though he was trying to move forward to put the past, and his relationship with Melody, behind him. But Melody, in the midst of her heartbreak, had a secret of her own. She was pregnant too. A secret she had kept hidden from everyone except McKinley. The revelation was as tragic as it was shocking. Melody, with her trusting heart, had fallen deeper in love with McKinley, believing that perhaps they could start fresh together, despite the pain of their recent breakup. But now, the truth of her pregnancy painted a far darker picture. Megan remembered a time, just days before Melody's disappearance, when her daughter had confided in her. It wasn't much, just a few scattered words about her future, her hopes, and a secret she hadn't told anyone: she was pregnant. But Melody had never shared this with anyone else in her life. She had kept it to herself, possibly out of fear or uncertainty, unsure of how to tell her mother or anyone else. Could McKinley have killed Melody to hide the truth about his 2 pregnancies? To erase any trace of a life he didn't want, one that complicated his future with Nikia? The thought sent a chill through the investigators. Was it possible that Melody's pregnancy had triggered the rage and jealousy that led to her brutal death? As detectives pieced the timeline together, they uncovered even more disturbing facts. The murder seemed to have occurred just after McKinley had learned of Melody's pregnancy. He had told his friends and family that he had no intentions of getting back with her, but his actions suggested otherwise. His erratic behavior, his decision to meet with Melody that night, his lies about their breakup. They all hinted at a man desperately trying to bury something he didn't want anyone to know. It wasn't just the pregnancy that could have driven McKinley to murder, it was the weight of betrayal. How could he face Nikia, his ex-girlfriend, and the mother of his unborn child, knowing that he had another child on the way with Melody? The 2 pregnancies, the overlapping relationships. Each new piece of the puzzle painted McKinley as a man with everything to lose. But the story didn't end there. Just after the breakup, Megan received a cryptic text message from an unknown number. The message was short, but the threat it contained was unmistakable: "I hate you and your family. Ain't safe." At first, Megan had brushed it off as the result of an angry ex-boyfriend. But now, with everything coming into focus, the pieces began to fall into place. The threatening message had been sent by someone who knew Melody intimately, someone close enough to know how to hurt her and her family. Investigators dug deeper into McKinley's phone records and discovered something chilling. The message Megan received, which at first had seemed like an empty threat, was traced back to a number registered under McKinley's name. The possibility that he had sent the message himself, that he had threatened Melody's family, began to look more and more likely. The chilling reality was settling in. McKinley wasn't just the last person to see Melody alive, he was a man at the center of a storm, caught between 2 women, 2 pregnancies, and a future that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. And as the investigation continued, the motive for Melody's murder seemed clearer with every passing day. The investigation had reached a boiling point. With each new piece of evidence, McKinley Lisma's story was starting to fall apart. The last person to see Melody alive, the ex-boyfriend with so many unanswered questions, was now the focus of the detectives' relentless scrutiny. They knew something wasn't right, and they were about to confront McKinley head-on. McKinley had been through a round of questioning already, but this was different. The room was colder now, the atmosphere thick with suspicion. His alibi was falling apart. His movements, tracked by traffic cameras, his phone and other witnesses, told a different story than the one he was telling. The detectives knew McKinley was hiding something, but the question was, how long could he keep up the lies? How long could he maintain this facade of innocence before the walls closed in on him? "I didn't see her that night," McKinley said, his voice calm, but with a hint of defensiveness. "We broke up weeks ago. I didn't go anywhere near her." The detectives exchanged a knowing glance. They had already seen the traffic camera footage. McKinley's blue Honda Accord was clearly visible near Melody's home, just after 11:20 p.m. McKinley had lied about his whereabouts, but now they had concrete proof. "You sure about that, McKinley?" one of the detectives asked, sliding the footage across the table. "Here you are on camera just down the street from Melody's house around the time she left. Care to explain?" McKinley's jaw clenched. His eyes darted between the detectives, trying to maintain composure. "I was just driving by. I wasn't near her. I didn't go in. I swear." The detectives kept pushing, weaving the story tighter around him. His phone records showed he had been in contact with Melody, not just through text but also with phone calls and data. They knew the murder happened around the same time his phone was near her final location. McKinley's lies were getting harder to maintain, and the pressure was mounting. But it was the next piece of evidence that would break the case wide open. When McKinley had been brought in for questioning, his car had been seized for a thorough search. And what the investigators found was chilling. A machete, 2 pairs of gloves, a roll of duct tape, and, most damning of all, a shirt stained with blood, a shirt belonging to Melody. The items tucked away in McKinley's vehicle were the same kind of tools used in a violent crime. But there was more. Investigators also found a bloody piece of climbing rope, similar to the kind used to bind Melody's hands. "We found these in your car, McKinley," one of the detectives said, the words cutting through the room like a knife. "A machete, duct tape, gloves, and this." He slid a bloody shirt across the table, right in front of him. "How do you explain that?" McKinley's eyes widened in shock. His breath hitched, and for a moment he struggled to find the words. His posture slumped, and the confident facade he had been maintaining cracked. The evidence was undeniable. McKinley had tried to distance himself from Melody, but the truth was catching up with him. His lies, his evasions, everything had led them to this moment. "I didn't mean for it to happen," McKinley muttered, his voice faltering. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't mean to kill her." The confession, though indirect, spoke volumes. McKinley had been caught. His attempt to hide the truth, his involvement in Melody's brutal murder, was now clear for all to see. The case was far from over, but McKinley's role in Melody's death was becoming undeniable. His lies, his erratic behavior, the damning evidence, everything pointed to one conclusion. The truth was out, and McKinley Lismo was at the center of it all. But the investigation didn't stop there. If McKinley had been involved, who else might have played a part in the twisted events that led to Melody's death? The detectives knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would take them to darker places, where the truth would be even more chilling than they could have imagined. As the investigation into Melody Hoffman's tragic death unfolded, one thing became abundantly clear. McKinley Lismo wasn't telling the whole truth. The web of lies was growing more tangled by the minute, and just when it seemed they had a clear picture, another name came to light. A new player had entered the story, someone McKinley had kept hidden in the shadows. McKinley's defense had shifted. No longer solely placing the blame on his own actions, he now claimed that a new friend, Dakota Van Patten, had been the mastermind behind the murder. According to McKinley, it was Dakota who had forced him to help bind and assault Melody. Dakota, he said, had appeared out of nowhere, a new acquaintance in McKinley's life, but one with a dark edge. Dakota Van Patten was a name that had yet to surface in the investigation. A young man barely 18 with a reputation for being reckless. But McKinley's story painted a chilling picture. He claimed that Dakota had arrived with a violent plan, one that McKinley had been unwillingly pulled into. The details were unsettling. Dakota had allegedly shown up at McKinley's house, armed with a gun, and threatened him, demanding that he help restrain Melody, forcing her into a horrifying situation. With McKinley's new story in mind, detectives began digging deeper into Dakota's background. They searched his home, hoping to find any clue that could corroborate McKinley's sudden shift in narrative. What they found would take the investigation down an even darker path. In Dakota's house, investigators uncovered several disturbing items. Among them was a length of climbing rope, the same type used to bind Melody during the attack. And then there it was, a pair of Melody's distinctive glasses, left carelessly behind in Dakota's room. How had they ended up there? Had he been involved? Had McKinley been telling the truth? The rope, the glasses, it all painted a picture that contradicted McKinley's claim of being an unwilling participant. If Dakota had truly been the mastermind, why were there so many signs pointing to his direct involvement? Why were these items found in his home? The investigation was unraveling fast, and every new discovery raised more questions than answers. But the investigation didn't stop there. As detectives continued to dig into Dakota's past, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Friends of Dakota's, people who had known him for years, came forward with stories that raised the stakes even higher. According to several individuals, Dakota had confided in them about the murder. In hushed tones, he had bragged about his role in it, almost as if the crime had been some twisted achievement. One friend recalled Dakota saying, "It had to be done." The words sent a chill down the spine of the investigators. What did Dakota mean by that? Was this cold-blooded rationalization, or was he confessing to something far more sinister? The words rang in the detectives' ears as they pieced together a horrifying narrative. Dakota hadn't just been a bystander, he had been a willing participant in the murder of Melody Hoffman. And worse yet, he seemed almost proud of it. The confession wasn't a direct one, but it was close enough. Dakota had shared details with his friends, boasting about how he and McKinley had taken Melody's life, and how he had planned every step of it. His motives remained murky, but one thing was clear: this wasn't a random act of violence. This was a calculated and deliberate crime, executed by two people who seemed to show little remorse. Reached a turning point. McKinley's shifting story only deepened the mystery, but one thing was certain: Dakota Van Patten wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was a key player in the horrific death of Melody Hoffman. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the full extent of the conspiracy was still shrouded in darkness. McKinley's lies, Dakota's bragging, and the twisted dynamic between the two men suggested a much larger story, one that the investigators were only beginning to uncover. The question now was not whether Dakota had been involved, but what role he had played in planning the murder, and whether there were others who had helped orchestrate it. Months had passed since Melody Hoffman's brutal murder. The investigation had uncovered shocking truths, and now the time had come to seek justice. The courtroom, normally a place of order and procedure, was filled with emotion and the weight of a tragic story that would soon be told to the world. The prosecution stepped forward first, their case poised with the kind of certainty that only comes when the evidence is irrefutable. They began to lay out their argument, detailing every piece of the investigation that tied McKinley to the crime. The testimony of the detectives, the physical evidence found in his car, the chilling machete recovered from his trunk, all of it painted a damning picture of a man who had not only participated in but had orchestrated a brutal murder. McKinley Lismo was the last person to see Melody Hoffman alive, the prosecutor stated, his voice firm, unwavering. The evidence places him at the scene of the crime, his car tracked by cameras, his phone pinging near her final location. But it wasn't just where he was that night, it was what he did. The machete, the bloody shirt, the duct tape, they all tell the story of a cold and calculated murder. As the prosecution moved forward, they introduced McKinley's own confession, the indirect one, spoken in hushed tones during his interrogation. He had admitted that it had to be done. The words haunted the courtroom, sending chills through the audience as they described the twisted psychology behind Melody's murder. The defense, however, wasn't going to let the prosecution have the final say so easily. They tried to undermine the evidence, attempting to portray McKinley as an unwilling participant, manipulated and forced into the murder by Dakota Van Patten. They argued that McKinley had been coerced, that he had acted out of fear, that he wasn't responsible for the heinous crime that had been committed. But the defense's argument felt weak. The mounting evidence, the phone records, the traffic camera footage, the physical evidence, painted a far different picture. McKinley's role in Melody's murder wasn't that of a passive bystander. He had been an active participant, a willing accomplice in a brutal, calculated act of violence. And then the emotional weight of the case truly hit the courtroom. Melody's mother, Megan, stood up to give her statement, her voice shaking with grief as she addressed the jury. She spoke about her daughter's trusting nature, the love they had shared, and the pain of losing her to someone who had promised to love her. "I will never understand how someone could do this to my baby," Megan said, tears streaming down her face. "She was kind, loving, and trusting. And she deserved so much more than this." Her words echoed in the courtroom, striking a chord with the jury and everyone in the room. The emotional testimony of Melody's family added weight to the prosecution's case, reminding everyone just how much had been taken that fateful night. The prosecutor rose for his closing statement, his voice now carrying the full force of the case he had built. This wasn't just a murder, it was the destruction of a bright future, a future full of hope. Melody Hoffman had dreams. She had love in her heart. And those dreams were brutally taken from her because McKinley Lisma couldn't face the consequences of his actions. The evidence shows that this was no accident. This was no impulsive act. This was calculated, planned, and executed with cold precision. The defendant, McKinley Lisma, was part of a twisted love triangle, one that ended in violence. His actions that night were driven by jealousy, by fear, and by a desire to cover up the truth. He murdered Melody to protect his own lies, to conceal the truth of his relationships and his secrets. And now justice must be served. Scene cuts to McKinley's face in the courtroom, his eyes darting nervously as the weight of the prosecutor's words sinks in. The room fell silent. The prosecutor had laid out the case with undeniable clarity. McKinley's fate now lay in the hands of the jury. The trial had reached its climax. The case was clear, the evidence overwhelming, and the emotional toll on Melody's family was impossible to ignore. But what would the jury decide? Would justice be served for Melody Hoffman? Or would the twists of the case leave a stain on the truth that would never fully be erased? After weeks of testimony, heart-wrenching moments in the courtroom, and the overwhelming weight of evidence, the trial of McKinley Lisma had reached its final moments. The question that had haunted Melody Hoffman's family, and indeed the entire community, was now in the hands of the jury. Would justice be served for a young woman whose life had been brutally taken? Or would the man who took it walk free? The hours stretched on. The waiting was unbearable. In the courtroom, Melody's family sat quietly, their eyes fixed on the doors. They had endured so much, but the final decision was now out of their control. As the jury filed back into the room, all eyes turned toward them. McKinley Lisma, sitting at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, waited for the news that would determine his future. The room fell into an eerie silence as the foreperson of the jury stood up to deliver their verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, McKinley Lisma, guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of kidnapping, and guilty of conspiracy to commit a forcible felony. The words echoed in the courtroom, cutting through the silence. Guilty. The justice that Melody's family had longed for had finally been delivered. McKinley's fate was sealed, and the cold, harsh truth of his involvement in Melody's death was now recognized by the law. McKinley, the man who had once promised Melody love and a future, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The pain in his mother's eyes, the community's collective sigh of relief. It was a moment of justice, but also a moment of sorrow. No verdict, no punishment, could bring back the life that had been so violently taken. But as the courtroom emptied, the journey wasn't over. McKinley's conviction didn't end the story. The haunting reality of the case wasn't fully resolved. Dakota Van Patten, McKinley's co-conspirator, the man who had helped carry out the murder, still stood at the center of the investigation. His trial was scheduled for the following year, and the full extent of his involvement remained unclear. The mystery of Dakota Van Patten's role in Melody's death, his cold demeanor, his connection to McKinley, and the chilling words he had spoken, still loomed large. While McKinley had been convicted, Dakota's trial promised more revelations. What drove him to participate in such a brutal act? And would the truth about his motivations ever fully come to light? As the focus shifted to Dakota's trial, the haunting question remained: what had really happened that night? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. Melody's family knew the truth about what had happened to their daughter, but the real why of it all, the motivations, the jealousy, the twisted minds behind the crime, would perhaps never be fully understood. "I'll never get her back," Megan said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But I'll make sure people remember who she was." Melody wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with a future. No one will ever really know why it happened. But we'll make sure she's remembered. Megan's words carried a profound weight. They spoke not just to the loss of her daughter, but to the resilience of a mother determined to keep her child's memory alive. The pain of losing Melody could never be erased, but in seeking justice, in standing strong for her daughter's legacy, Megan had found a way to fight back against the darkness that had overtaken their lives. The story of Melody Hoffman was far from over. Justice had been served for McKinley, but Dakota's trial loomed on the horizon. The truth behind the crime was still unfolding, one chapter at a time. For now, though, Melody's story had come to its first conclusion. A life lost, but a memory that would never fade. And as Megan had promised, Melody would always be remembered.